Welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast. I'm your host, Matt ZAUN. Thank you for joining us as we uncover how stories are one of the most important aspects of your business. We'll talk about struggles, victories, and how you can utilize strategic storytelling to inspire those around you to action. Enjoy this episode. Traveling all around the country, speaking with business leaders, there seems to be one challenge that consistently comes up in every circle, and that is the challenge of supply chain issues. Everyone has frustration with it. Everyone has negative experiences that is impacting their business. And I'm excited to unpack supply chain issues with my guest today, because today I'm joined by Josh RENICKER, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Energy Access, which is the industry leader in battery charging technology. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thanks, Matt. I'm looking forward to digging in and unpacking what we can.
I am so intrigued with this topic. I was literally anticipating our conversation today because I hear this all the time. With leaders are concerned, they're confused, they are antsy because the last few years, it's been nothing but radical change, unexpected things that they couldn't even fathom, prior to the COVID years. Because I feel like we're almost spoiled, especially in the United States, where a lot of people, they never even really thought of supply chain issues before, at least the common individual, and now it's on everyone's mind. So I'm really interested to unpack this with you. So because of your experience and you deal heavily within the supply chain issue category that we're talking about, can you take us through the last couple of years? Can you take us prior to the COVID years and what radically changed starting in 2020?
Yeah, I want to. You're absolutely right, and I love that you use the word spoiled, because honestly, in the last few years, we've really shined a light on how spoiled procurement professionals have been, because we've been able to go out, find parts, we've been able to find suppliers, we've been able to validate suppliers, we've been able to do all those things. And then we weren't, and then we couldn't find parts. We lead times were long, prices are going up, all these different things are impacting, and all of those issues have kind of been thrown together into supply chain issues, right? And I put that in quotes. So, that's one of the challenges is what's the real problem, right? It's everybody blames it on, well, we have supply chain issues. Okay, does that mean that your procurement people can't plan? Or does that mean your suppliers that you validated, did you fail to validate them correctly? So, those are the kind of questions that come to mind. And like I said, I love that you use the word spoiled, because, what we're seeing is companies that were kind of relying on almost strong arming their supply chain. Some of the larger international companies have a reputation for not really having a relationship with a supplier. It's more of I'm going to demand you to do this. And the suppliers are like, I really want to do business with this company, so I'm just going to bend over and do what they asked me to do. But then it came to a point where, hey, I'm a big company, but now I need to rely on myself. I need to go and ask, I need to be curious about my supplier. I need to understand how my supplier does business. And we saw that suppliers are like, you weren't interested when times were good. So why would I want to open my doors and share everything that we're dealing with now that you need me to do that? So that's one thing that I saw. And, I've been in this role, in this kind of lead operations role with Energy Access now for going on 16 years. And, of course we have purchasing folks and we have procurement folks, but me, I take full responsibility for our supply chain. I've walked the factory floor of everybody we do business with. I have personal relationships with absolutely every supplier. And for me, that's been key. So the disruption for us has been minimal because we've had full transparency. So that, when you brought up the word spoiled, I'm like, man, that really hits it on the head, right? Because it's like, if you weren't worried about relationship before, in crisis is not the time to build a relationship, right? In crisis is when you need to rely on that relationship. So, that's what I've seen as a big transition.
So you bring up an extremely invaluable point that I want to unpack. And obviously this is not a financial discussion, but I think it correlates is if you're a financial advisor, it's easy in a bull market. You can make people money, you can project things out. It's when we hit that bear market that really the financial advisors that are really good at what they do step up and come to the plate. I almost feel like this is the exact same situation. Well, not the exact same, but in comparison, that when everything's going easy, you don't even really need to worry about things. You don't even think about it. We are spoiled. And then in a crisis, relationships are paramount to your success. You had mentioned like you have to have a plan, you have to have strategy, you have to be already cultivating these relationships because you don't want to build a relationship in crisis. It's better to have it before it happens. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So for leaders that are out there that have never thought of even establishing a relationship with a supplier, what do you recommend that they do or look for? What does that even look like to a CEO or an executive in a position that they're doing a lot of other stuff right now? What should they be mindful of regarding that relationship?
That's a that's a great question. And everybody kind of does it a little bit differently. And one of the things that I use to communicate this with is doing business internationally is really where the relationship matters. And what I've learned over the years, and I've been burned a number of times, is I can't do business like an American outside of America. So I can't just give a list of requirements and get a quote and then send a purchase order and know it's going to work. So that's the biggest thing that I would say. So for me, what I found as being invaluable is going to the factory, going to the supplier. There's lots of value put into kind of third-party certification or third-party validation stuff, right? So there's I don't know if you're familiar with ISO standards and those kind of things, but so ISO 9001 is a thing that basically, companies can set up a quality management system and then be third-party validated, and they at least have a checklist saying they do these things regarding their business, right? So that's a great kind of bottom line marker to do business with a company. But when I go and audit a company, and I'm going to talk specifically about kind of my approach to building relationship outside of the U.S., right? So when I'm vetting a supplier in China. And now, when I first started in this business, we weren't able to go in and directly communicate with China without having a broker of some kind or some other representative out from Hong Kong or from the US or wherever with us to go into the factory. But now you can go to the factory. Pretty much every factory has an English speaking person that can support you visiting them and kind of take you through. And I've probably been in and audited 50 factories in China, I bet, over the last 15 years. And one of the things that is always interesting to me is they want to put on a show a bit, right? Everybody wants to like prepare for the visit, prepare for the audit. And that same mentality kind of is a barrier to actually learning and being curious about how they actually do business. Because what ends up happening is you go in, you sit down in a conference room, and they start bringing you all the data and all the books and all the things that they think you want to see. And for me, I'm like, look, guys, I want to spend 10 minutes in the conference room, and I want to enjoy a coffee or a tea with you. I want to get to know you a little bit. And then let's go walk. I want to take a walk. Let's go walk the factory floor. Let me see some things working. Let me see how it all comes together. And it's all in the spirit of communication. Is there some value that I can add while I'm in the factory performing an audit, right? So if I go in with the mentality of I can't wait to find them doing all these things wrong, and I'm going to have this checklist and I'm going to check them off, and they need to do this and they need to do that. Does that help build a relationship? No, that's the opposite, right? Now I'm just like Now they feel like they're taking a test the whole time I'm there. Like for me, I want to go walk the floor like, oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen that done that way before. How did you guys come up with that, with this approach? Right. So you start the conversation, and then you start getting, and specifically in China, you end up with kind of 2-3 people with you that can speak English. So you end up asking some of these curiosity questions, and you see the people get excited because they were part of putting that together. Right. And even though they're not speaking English, they start to describe what they're doing. And even though I can't translate for myself, I get the spirit of what they're saying. Right. So now the spirit of my visit is memorable for those people. So now when they see my company name come across and they're building my product, now they're building it for me. They're not building it for Energy Access. They're building it for Josh Rennicker.
Yeah, that's a really important part. And you're doing a couple things right now. So you're explaining a story that people are going to tell themselves. So they had this positive experience with you, and now you're not just a name or a number on a sheet. Now they're actually part of that story. So they're going to want to step up to the plate for you even more, which is so powerful in business. And that goes back to what you said regarding relationships. But I do want to focus in on something that I don't want people to miss, is the importance of cultural communication. It's so unbelievably important. And you also mentioned English. And everyone listening knows that English in the United States is not necessarily English in the United Kingdom or English in Australia. So depending on where your supplier is, it's really good to understand basics of communication. I mean, I could share a horror story with you with that. During the COVID years, I was doing a lot more visual workshop or virtual workshops, and I was speaking to an Australian audience, and I'm a big football fan. I love my football. And I use the terminology in the United States, I'm rooting for XYZ. So I have the I say often, hey, Josh, I'm rooting for you and your company. I'm rooting for your success. Well, rooting in Australia is essentially like saying the F word. So I came on this workshop and we went through all these different things. And I said, everyone, I'm rooting for your, whatever it was. And the faces that I got, I didn't understand what was happening, but the faces I got was complete and utter horror and shock, like I had just said the F word to everyone. Very simple, but that's a cultural difference. So I really encourage people when they're doing business in China, they're doing business in the UK, they're doing business in Brazil, Australia, whatever country it is, do basic research on the do's and don'ts. Gestures are different. This is more of an audio podcast, but there is differences in hand gestures, facial expressions, sometimes even eye contact. I mean, the United States, we're very big on really good eye contact. Some cultures, they're not big on eye contact. So it's really good to understand cultural norms prior to going into a situation.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So the first time I went to Thailand, I met somebody that I'd been communicating with via email for probably 8 or 9 months and never actually had a vocal conversation with them. And here, this guy was Chinese. So his parents were born in China. So he's Chinese, but he was born in Thailand, but then grew up in Australia.
Wow.
So he's living in Thailand. He could speak Thai, English with an Australian accent, and Chinese. So, that's a perfect example, right? Because his English was really good. But I had no idea. When he started talking to me verbally when I met him, I was like, he's Australian. This is the weirdest thing. So, and another quick story about that is, so whenever I'm traveling, I hate to use the term like dumb down, but I simplify my language, right? You have to simplify your language and get rid of and eliminate all of the weird slang things that we use. And the US has so much slang, and you don't realize that until you have to remove all that from your vocabulary. But I spent, in the early days, I would have the factories come and pick me up from my hotel and drive me to the factory. And it'd always be 3 or 4 people in the car. And the drive was always 2 hours. It seemed like no matter how close or far we were from the factory and my hotel, it was always a 2-hour drive for some reason. And we spent the one drive, so 2 hours, we spent the entire time, me and a colleague I had with me, were teaching everybody in the car the many different ways that US people can explain somebody being intoxicated. We spent the entire trip just talking about, drunk and wasted. I just went through all these different things, and it was a hilarious conversation. And then they were translating it in Chinese, and just everybody in the car was cracking up laughing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there are so many things and so many phrases we use that can be misunderstood, construed, offensive. Like you said. I mean, you could offend people without even knowing that you're saying something offensive, and you could be in a culture where it's not appropriate for them to communicate that you've offended them. That's the other part.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so what you're saying, unbelievably valuable, which the main point is focus on the audience.
Correct.
English, and I think sometimes when I say this, it's very, very difficult for people to understand because we're in it, right? If you're raised, especially in a Western culture, specifically the United States, we take English for granted, and we don't really think of all the ins and outs of English. English is one of the most difficult languages to fully grasp and understand. There are people that spend decades studying English and they're still learning different things. I mean, say to someone in Asia, baseball isn't my cup of tea. And see the response. Like, no one knows what that even means outside of a US audience. And so I think what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it's really important to understand the audience that you're speaking to. And this is so important for the future growth of everyone's company, because you have upwards of 1 billion people in the next decade coming online across the world. That is going to open up business opportunities, not only in the US, but across the globe like we've never seen before. Well, a lot of these individuals, what we're saying and think we're saying is not what they're receiving. So it's really, really good that as more individuals in Asia and Africa and a lot of these different continents come online and we can be engaged in commerce with them, how are they viewing our speech? How are they viewing the stories we're telling? How are they viewing the way we're presenting ourselves? So what you're saying, I know it sounds simple and basic, but so few people actually take a step back and they focus on the strategy, on what they're actually saying to the individuals they're speaking to. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, and honestly, Matt, I want to take it a step further, because there's only so much research you can do, right? There's only so much poking around the internet and learning cultural differences and all those different things. So, for me, I've just found it extremely helpful to just default to curiosity, right? It's like, hey, I'm an American. I'm traveling in Vietnam, and start with that, right? I'm here to learn. So, teach me if I'm not doing something right. What is the appropriate way? Like, I remember my first trip to China. I didn't know how to use chopsticks, and I went on YouTube and learned via YouTube how to use chopsticks, and went to China and, sat down at the first meal with, 7 Chinese folks around the table. And I'm like getting ready to pick up my chopsticks. I'm sweating, like, oh my gosh, am I gonna make a complete fool of myself? And, and there I find later on, they're thinking, I wonder if this American can use chopsticks. So they were like excited to go through that journey with me. So, it's something that I learned after we ate, of course, and they were complimenting me. They're like, oh, you're very good chopsticks, very traditional. Okay, I learned on YouTube. I that's how I learned. And they were just cracking. They were like, what's YouTube? Because China doesn't get YouTube. So there's lots of those kind of things that happen. But for me, it's do the research, understand kind of at a high level some things that people are willing to offer up there. But then just default to curiosity. Ask the question, right? People are teachers at heart. People want to share what they do and what's appropriate and what's. Just all you got to do is ask. You just have to be curious.
Extremely valid point. So I love, so there's three C's that are coming to my mind. You had mentioned curiosity. That's one. Also cultural, and then community. So in the United States, we're very individualistic, right? We're very into achievement, self-absorbed, and it really does borderline selfishness. We're constantly thinking about number one. A lot of other cultures are not like that. They're very community oriented. So whenever I'm sharing stories in different regions of the world, I'm very focused on the community aspect. How can I bring everyone together from a community perspective? Because they don't understand a lot of the individualistic freedom, rah-rah type stuff we have over here. And that's really important. So like, for instance, I do a lot of business in India. And in India, they, and rightly so, they love showing the beauty of their country. They have a ton of beauty, tons of beauty. I mean, there's a lot of places in India that it's mind-boggling, just the sheer beauty of their art, their culture, their music, just the scenery. So whenever I'm sharing stories, I very much focus in and paint the picture of beauty. And back to your point about the chopstick story, a lot of cultures are so excited to bring you into the fold with their culture. Like, they have a sense of good pride when it comes to that. So they're more than willing and excited to show you. And I feel like sometimes in the US, it's almost like an ego thing where we're not willing to humble ourselves. Like, we want to look awesome in front of them. And that's great. Like, we do want to connect, but in essence, they're more than willing to help us. And I feel like you were ready and able to not only show them, hey, here's what I'm doing, but also allow them to be excited about their culture. So I think that's a really, really important point.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the big cultural shifts that I had to make when traveling overseas was not having that time for myself once I arrive somewhere. The culture is pretty much everywhere around Asia that I've been, has been that somebody wants to take care of me. Somebody wants to show me something. Somebody wants to be my tour guide. And as an American, generally speaking, we want to settle first, right? Like, let me get my hotel room. Let me get things settled. Let me catch up on email, whatever it happens to be. Like, we want some silo time. We want some cave time. If we use the kind of Mars Venus ideology there, but other cultures are not that way, because it's very much like and one of the things that when I have somebody new travel with me, specifically to China, is I'm like, okay, when we get to the airport and we're in the international terminal and we're getting ready to board the plane, you need to leave your personal space at the airport. Like, don't even bring your personal space with you, because it's going to be violated the rest of the trip. Right? Like, I mean, it's the way people drive. It's the way you board a train. It's the way you sit down. It's everywhere, right? It's the way you queue up, the way you get in line. I mean, everything is shrinked personal space. And in most cultures, because countries are so heavily populated, personal space isn't a thing. So, that's one of the things that I always tell folks is, like, you've got to just accept that your personal space is gone. It's left. And the first time they experience that is usually on a train, right? They get on a train, they're like, okay, I got my space. And then we go to the next stop and 400 more people cram on the same car, and it's like, oh, this is uncomfortable. Like, yeah, get comfortable being uncomfortable. That's part of travel. That's part of culture. That's part of learning. And, I think once you get over that and you start to view the activity and the world and the culture in that kind of lens of that, look, they don't have personal space. That's not a thing. Then you start to see, oh, that's why people drive the way they do. That's why traffic is so close. That's why a 4-lane highway becomes 8 lanes. So all that stuff is for reference.
Sure. That's a really good point. You mentioned driving. It just popped in my head. So I live in the Philadelphia area, and driving in Philadelphia is not the same as driving in Los Angeles. So even in the same country, it could be different worlds. So I will throw that out there too, but it's even more so in other countries. You're absolutely right. One of the questions that I'm very interested in in hearing your perspective, and obviously we can't predict the future, but there are different indications where I'm interested, based on all your experience, if you even remotely think that this is feasible. So and again, using the word spoiled, for decades now, we've had an incredible global community when it comes to supply chain. And now there's little fractures happening where a lot of people are talking about focusing more on producing in the United States, shipping in the United States, and really pulling away from different elements of this globalization when it comes to supply chain. In your experience, in your opinion, is that even feasible? Are we talking decades for the United States to do that? How much connecting with Asia and a lot of what you had just mentioned, is that still going to be very prevalent in the next few decades, or do you see a lot of supply chain shifting to nationally the United States in of itself?
Yeah, so great question, and I wish I knew the answer, but I have some feelings, I have some thoughts. One of them that comes up as the biggest barrier to us, to America, the U.S., bringing business back or growing manufacturing is really twofold. One is, who's going to pay for it? Because there's lots of factories around, but those factories closed 20 years ago, and the technology in those factories is way outdated. So somebody's going to have to invest a lot of money to get that up and running. I mean, obviously, we've got some of the big retailers that are building massive warehouses, right? That are state of the art, all automated. A 1 million square foot warehouse can run with 4 people. And so, it's that world, but that takes a ton of money to put in place. And then the other part is, much of what is being built overseas is labor intensive. So if we're going to recreate an environment in the US with labor intensive jobs, who are we going to hire? Right? There's too many other ways to make money than to have somebody sit in a chair in a big warehouse and put widgets together for minimum wage. That's not a realistic thing to expect in the US. And even if we do find people to do that, and we're able to build the flat screen TV that you can buy at Walmart for under $1,000, now that TV becomes $10,000 again, right? Because minimum wage is what it is. So that's, I feel like we're too far past having a huge population that's looking for factory work, and there's still way too much out there that's labor intensive. And the only way it's going to come back is if somebody invests a lot of money and it's all automated, and you're able to run a whole factory with a handful of people. So that's where I think the biggest barriers are. So, do I think we're decades away? If we are, the US is about to go through some pain that it hasn't seen maybe ever before, because we're going to have to see the industrial climate that we're in now completely crumble and fall apart, and then have to build from zero again. So, I mean, if we're looking to bring it back, we have to crumble first. We have to completely fall apart and then build back up, because we can't go backwards now. So that's where I think we are.
So what I'm hearing you say is that regardless of if the person listening to this conversation is a millennial, a Gen Xer, or a baby boomer, in their lifetime, the likelihood that we're going to see that drastic of a shift is extremely unlikely. In addition, everything that you're saying will still be relevant in the years to come, that we need to continue to build relationships with our suppliers overseas. We need to focus on cultural communication, and we need to focus on our audience. I mean, really, we live in a global community. We're going to be doing more and more business globally. It's how can we continue to be successful at doing that?
Yeah, I mean that's correct, right? I mean, if you look at the industrial age, right? So we go back to the boom of the auto industry, right? So Ford can hire as many people as he wants to hire, right? Why could he do that? Because people were there. He had people waiting in line to go in and go to work, right? So if we're trying to get back to that, we then have to create that environment, that atmosphere where people are waiting in line to get to work. But we're seeing the opposite of that, right? We have jobs that we can't go find people for. So if we can't have one without the other. And I mean, I think you mentioned India. India is still a developing country. It's a developing country of more than 1 billion people. But I mean, more and more industry is going to move there because they still have people looking for work. They still have people waiting in line, willing to do whatever to get paid. And there's other countries, around kind of that Asian corridor there that are in that same boat. I think of Thailand. Thailand is a perfect example, and I've done business in Thailand for 15 years now. I love doing business in Thailand, except for their lack of urgency. They're just like, hey, can I have this next month? And they're like, well, yeah, well, next month, you mean? Yeah, it's okay. Just take your time. Don't give me a
That's
date.
awesome.
It's perfectly fine. But yeah, it's but that's the same idea, right? It's still kind of that developing country mentality, and we're still going to be chasing pennies, right? There's still going to be things that need to be built by human hands. And where can the world find the least expensive human hands to do the work? That's always that's still going to be, and that has been for hundreds of years. That's been the case, right? So, I do think this is going to be relevant for the decades to come. I don't see the world shrinking. I don't see a ton of business coming back. I hate to say coming back because nobody wants to go back, right? Nobody wants to go backwards. So you don't bring it back. You have to reinvent. You have to do things a new way, which is that's why we saw retailers come and take over the top spaces of the biggest companies in the U.S. because, hey, we can get this stuff built somewhere else. We can have robots pull it down off a shelf and put it in a box to ship somewhere. So let's do that. Let's invest our money in that. So, that's I think is what's going to keep things relevant. And, those shelves still need to be stocked by somebody building something for very little money for that model to continue. And right now we have plenty of opportunity to go out and build those relationships and make it make sense. I mean, China's a perfect example, right? So China is still considered a developing. They're kind of mid-level now, but they're still considered a developing country. But as wages continue to increase in China, okay, well, let's just go to South Korea now. Let's just go to Vietnam now, right? It's not about like let's come back to the U.S. because the U.S. is developed. The U.S. is far above what's considered reasonable wage rates for a lot of the little widget things that are being done. And I say that in a spirit of we use it too, right? Because it's the only way for us to stay cost competitive in the market. We run up against Chinese competitors that are less expensive than us, but the value of the work that I and Energy Access put into vetting, validating, and maintaining our strong supply chain is why people do business with us. They come to us knowing that I'm on the factory floor every year. They know that I know what's going on in the factory because they could tell me, yeah, they're building it right, but until I see it, till I experience it, I don't believe it. So, I have to get there. I have to walk on the floor. I have to see our product being built because then I can go to our customers and say, yeah, we do business with these companies because they do business the way we do business. It's more than just can they build our product at a reasonable price. It's do they do business the way we do business because that's most important to me because I want to be able to, when times are tough, know, not just hope, but know that our full supply chain is in our court. They're in our corner. They're doing everything they can do to support us. And the delays that we've experienced, I mean, we've had components push out a year. How do you have a year worth of components and things? How do you push that stuff out a year? To me, that's mind boggling, right? I've made this product. It's been available. Lead times have been 2 to 3 weeks. Now it's a year. What? That makes no sense to me. So yeah, I mean, to me, it's the relationship side and knowing, right? It's not just, we have pretty good supply chain, and I hope they're doing good. No, know that they're doing good, right? Know that they're doing good work for you in good ways and doing business the way you want to do business. I think that's the most important thing.
So there's a huge lesson in what you said. And then also I do have a question regarding what you said. So the lesson that I'm hearing and what I really want people to focus on is you're an officer of a company, but you still take time to talk with individuals in a warehouse. You still take time to go through and unpack their stories. That is so unbelievably powerful. I don't want people to miss it because I feel like there's a lot of officers, executives of different companies where they're looking at sheets, they're looking at numbers on a paper. But if they really dig into the challenges that people in a warehouse are going through, they're going to learn a lot that they could be doing to actually increase their business. I found personally that if leadership of an organization asks something as simple as, what's exciting you right now? What's angering you right now? To everyone in the organization, some of the responses that they're going to get are going to help them streamline the process. I mean, go into a warehouse and say, what's exciting you right now? What's angering you right now? And they're going to be bringing up different things. Oh, I can't find this one item. I can't find, like, all the crates look the same. All this, if I was able to do A, B, and C, I'd be able to grab it quicker. I'd be able to, and then they're going to be helping you, the leader of the organization. So I think what you said is so unbelievably valuable. I think every business leader needs to be paying more attention to just walking around every aspect of their business and finding out, how it works. So that's the value piece that I think you really added with what you said. One of the questions that I have for you, so you mentioned large retailers, and obviously I'm sure a lot of people are thinking Amazon, and Amazon spoiled us to no end where, we get boxes. I get boxes now in a matter of hours, not 2 days, in a matter of hours. And that's coming across the entire country. So whenever I'm told, you got to wait a week or two. What do you mean I have to wait a week or two? I can't get this in 2 hours. So it's not until there's a snag in that process. And I'm thinking car sales. So, you think about car sales in the last couple of years, the radical inflation in costs. And a lot of that had to do with different things in relation to the supply chain category. So my question to you, Josh, is, do you think in the next year or two, some of these issues won't be issues? We're going to kind of go back to business as it was? Or do you think that we're constantly going to have to be creative regarding geopolitical events that happen that shift supply chain? Are we ever going to see a 2019 normal in the next few years, or is that just not the world we're living in?
All right, I'm gonna put my tinfoil hat on here for a second. Okay?
That's awesome.
Tinfoil hat's going on just for a second. So let's say that there was a big push in a developing country to focus on improving emissions and electrifying vehicles. Let's just say that was happening. Not saying it is, but let's just say. And let's say that there's a city in the south of said country that's growing very quickly that was able to electrify their entire taxi fleet of the entire city of 14 million people in 9 months. Let's just say that could happen, okay? So if that can happen, then could it also happen that the electronics in said vehicles are built in the same factories as components that are needed for an industry in a developed country that seems to to have a little bit of fractured relationship with said developing country. And the government maybe has some power to limit what leaves the borders of said developing country because they can focus on what they're doing internally. So, that, and again, I have tinfoil hat on, big tinfoil hat. So, I could see the situation we're in being because of some restrictions, tariffs, those kind of things put in place. And hey, then as a government that controls literally everything that happens in the country, we're going to focus all of the technology in these factories to what we're trying to do internally. And it doesn't matter what we disrupt, because by the time we're ready to release electronics to those countries, they're going to have to spend all their resources on stuff they've already built 2 years ago that are now outdated, that now we can grab and move forward. So I'll take the tinfoil hat off now. But yeah, so I feel like we are in a very interesting period, and specifically the 2020s could be a very pivotal year in industry as a whole. And I know that there are initiatives in China specifically to become the world industrial leader, and they want to do that by 2025. And what would the government do to make that happen? I mean, I hate to use the word limitless, but the things that I've seen happen. I mean, again, electrifying an entire taxi fleet of a city of 14 million people in 9 months tells me that some pretty amazing things could be done.
So I'm hearing a lot of change, right? You're saying that we will continue to see changes as we go on. And for leaders that have said, if I could just push through, because we're going to get back to 2019, that may never come. And what's interesting to me is I see a lot of people that they'll talk about change and they'll talk about the importance of change. But then when change really happens, they don't want anything to do with it. So we need to embrace the change. It's obviously simpler. It's easier said than done. It sounds simple, but it's something we absolutely need to embrace. So yeah. Josh, thank you so much for your time. There's so many valuable pieces that you shared with us that I want to recap before we close out our time together. I have 5 main takeaways from our conversation. So you had said in the beginning, it's better to establish a relationship prior to a crisis. I think that is unbelievably important. And there could be potential crisis that is looming in the years ahead, which adds to the change part, that people really need to focus on these relationships now, not in a year from now. So better to establish a relationship prior to a crisis. You also mentioned about focusing on cultural communication and really how different cultures communicate differently. And we had talked about how English in the United States is not necessarily English in the United Kingdom or English in Australia, that there's all different elements of English. There's different nuances with English that we need to be cognizant of. You had mentioned about focusing on the audience and really understanding the audience we're talking to. I know it sounds simple and we've heard that before, but truly taking a step back, hearing what we're saying and trying to experience what we're saying in someone else's shoes is so important. Then another thing, which I think is unbelievably valuable, is what you said about you talking with people and hearing their stories at all different levels of your organization and your business, not just the leaders that you work with, not just your direct reports, but you actually go into factories, you actually go into warehouses and ask people what is happening, hearing their stories, which is such an unbelievably paramount aspect of leadership, I truly believe. And then also the 5th part is, for me, change. I'm hearing that we're going to constantly be experiencing change in the years ahead. We need to embrace it. We need to figure out how to creatively adapt and continue to pivot. Pivot is, as much as people hate that P word, pivot, because it was like the mantra of 2020. We need to continue to figure out ways to pivot going forward. So Josh, thank you so much for your time. If people want to hear more about you, what you do, what your organization does, the awesome work that you do, where's the best way that they can connect with you?
Yeah, for me, I'm super active on LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn, Jay Renicker, on LinkedIn. I'll connect with anybody. We'll hop in the DMs. My DMs are busy every day. Just don't try to sell me, because that shuts down the DM pretty fast.
That's a valid point right there.
I get pitch slapped a lot. So don't do that. Let's build a relationship and go from there. And then, I mean, if you want to, you're welcome to email me, jrenicker@energyaccess.com. You can find that on our website, energyaccess.com. So yeah, I'm looking forward. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was a fun conversation. I feel like we got through about a third of what we could have talked about. So,
for sure.
So yeah, thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you have a story that you would like to share, feel free to drop an email to matt@mattzaun.com with the subject line Stories with Traction. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share tons of resources on how you can be a better storyteller. Remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.